On a question, the member for Kew.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Premier. The government's secret decision to cut $2.4 billion from public schools means that Victorians will now lag 3 years behind Queensland and 6 years behind New South Wales in adopting the Gonski reforms. Why is the Premier cutting billions of dollars from public schools?
Premier, without assistance.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank the member for Kew for her question because it gives me the opportunity to be absolutely clear about my government's commitment to public education, because it is only Labor governments that invest in public education. This might be a record, Speaker, a record from the member for Kew, who up until this point has only ever asked about private schools in Kew. She's only ever asked questions in this place about private schools in Kew, Speaker. Oh, if I missed it.
Order. Point of order, Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, on relevance, it's a very narrow question to the Premier about cutting $2.4 billion from state schools. I'd ask you to ask the Premier to come back to that question instead of attacking the opposition.
Order. Leader of the House on the point of order.
Speaker, there is no point of order. The Premier was being entirely relevant to the question. It did ask about funding of government schools, and the Premier is taking the opportunity to update the House on our government's ongoing commitment to public education.
Order. I remind the Premier not to attack the opposition. Come back to answering the question.
But I will remind the House of the fact that this government, our government, has made the biggest increase of any state or territory to government school funding of 34%. And then when you also consider the $17 billion that we've invested in new school buildings, and we've made this investment. We've made this investment because, as Premier, I support our teachers and staff. We support them to have the buildings and the facilities, and also, too, so importantly, we support students to have access to those critically important wellbeing services that are offered in schools, in government schools, because we've invested in nurses, in doctors, in glasses for kids, in mental health support staff for students in government schools. And I say, Speaker—
Further point of order, Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, the Premier is debating the question. I'd ask you to ask her to come back to the very narrow question of cutting funds to state schools.
So you don't care about dental and health and lenses in schools?
That's a very narrow question. Oh, sorry, Leader of the House, on the point of order.
Speaker, there is no point of order. The Premier continues to be relevant in her answer. She's not debating the question. She's getting on with informing the House of our government's commitment to fund government schools in this state. Oh, this
it was. Further to the point of order, member for Nepean.
Thank you, Speaker. Further to the point of order, the question related to recurrent funding and the Gonski report, not capital funding to which the Premier is referring.
Order. It was order. Order. Minister will come to order. It was a very narrow question. The Premier was being relevant, but I do remind the Premier that it was a very narrow question.
Of the member for Nepean, that 34% increase I was talking about is exactly recurrent funding that is going into government schools, Speaker. So I'm delighted that the member for Nepean has been swatting up over the break, reading the budget papers. Maybe the member for Brighton's been giving him a bit of a helping hand on going through the budget papers, getting ready for his big day next Tuesday, Speaker. His big day next Tuesday. But, Speaker, what I was also going to, in terms of answering the question from the member for Kew, is the support that we give to teachers, to buildings, but also importantly too to students around what goes on in government schools. And I say this as Premier. I also say this absolutely clearly, Speaker, as a parent who sends her kids to government schools. And I see firsthand every single day of what a good, strong government education provides for students, regardless of who they are, regardless of the wealth of the family that they come from, regardless of their background. They know in Victoria they can get a good government education because we back them, and so too does the Albanese Labor government, which is why we are working with them right now on that outcome that has been driven for a number of years in getting our government schools fully resourced. And that is because we are committed to government schools. I'm committed to them as a parent, and I'm committed to them as the Premier, and we'll continue to back and invest in our great government education system here in Victoria.
On a supplementary question, the member for Kew.
Does the Minister for Education speak for the government when he says that this $2.4 billion cut to schools will damage Victoria's reputation and embed Victoria's status as Australia's lowest funder of students at public schools?
Check if he said it.
Leader of the Opposition will come to order. Premier.
Well, thank you, Speaker. And this again, it's a pattern of behaviour from the Leader of the Opposition. I didn't think it was a pattern of behaviour we'd see from the member for Kew for coming in and absolutely putting misleading statements to the House. I'll tell you what, the Deputy Premier and Minister for Education and every single one of the members of this government will do is we'll back our government schools. And I know this is a tough concept for the member for Kew because Liberal governments, they cut funding to government schools. They cut Fresh Through Friday. They cut the education maintenance allowance. They didn't invest in building new schools, which meant we had not enough schools being opened from their time in government.
Leader of the House. Point of order, member for Kew.
Point of order, Speaker. On relevance, the Premier is debating the question. It's a very narrow question about whether the Minister for Education speaks for the government when he says this is going to damage Victoria's reputation.
I believe the Premier had already responded to the question. The Premier has continued.
Because I'll say this, we'll continue to invest. We'll continue to invest in government schools and we'll continue to invest in those frontline services because we back our government school system, we back our teachers, we back our staff, and can I thank them for the work they do every single day.